Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Happy Birthday, Fairchild, 50th anniversary. I'd like to start out by asking how many people visited the Google search engine yesterday? Could you raise your hands? Not as many in some younger audiences, but quite a lot of you. But if you did, you obviously don't need me to tell you that Sputnik was launched October the 4th, 50 years ago. Same year as Fairchild Semiconductor was founded. There are a few other items on this list of popular things that people remember. As a teenager growing up in England, the only one I really remember is the Everly Brothers, Wake Up Little Susie. But 1957 was a landmark year for many, many reasons. One item that does not make these popular lists, of course, is the founding of Fairchild Semiconductor in Palo Alto in September 1957. And in my dual role as a 1966 to 1972 alumnus of Fairchild and as a member of the Semiconductor Special Interest Group, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to the founders, Fair Children and Friends, to this 50th anniversary. In addition to Gordon Moore, we do have at least one other founder here tonight with us, Jay Last. Jay, you're in the audience somewhere, I believe. Jay, over here. I believe Julius Blank was also on the list. Julius, are you here anywhere? Well, maybe Julius is going to join us tomorrow night. And Sheldon Roberts could not join us, but he does send his regards. So, happy 50th, gentlemen. Before I introduce the panel, I'd like to ask John Toole, CEO of the Computer History Museum, to welcome you to this world-class institution that is dedicated to preserving and presenting the artifacts and information, artifacts and stories of the information age, with an increasing focus on the contributions of semiconductor technology. The museum has been extremely generous in allowing us free use of the facilities and hundreds of hours of staff time in helping to organize this event. So please welcome John Toole.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone, and boy, what a great crowd. What a great event. Congratulations. I mean, it means so much when you can relate to what really this is all about and what history is all about. How many people have never been to this museum before? Wow, incredible, incredible. Well, we're here to preserve our history over time, and we take that very, very seriously. And some people ask, well, why are we interested in semiconductors? Well, think of computing history, what makes computing special. It's all the ecosystem of the whole industry and the technology sector that really makes that special. And that's exactly what you have provided. You started it all, and congratulations to you all. You should be proud partners with us as we try to preserve your history with your help. We've been collecting for almost 30 years and really have grown to be the largest collection of artifacts in the world in information technology. You know, some of you may have known us from the Boston days. We moved the collection in '96, opened at NASA Ames, and from there we purchased this building in 2002. Note, we had to purchase the building. We had to borrow money to do that. Hint, hint. And we opened to the public in 2003. We've really grown dramatically in the last number of years, been financially in the black for as long as at least 10 or 11 years, because we have a disciplined approach to really grow something special on your behalf. Downstairs, I hope you saw a sample of what we're going to have in our collection. Very interesting exhibits, but it's only our first phase. And in 2009, we're going to put in place our signature exhibit, the Timeline of Computing History, 14,000 square feet, and include a very significant semiconductor presence in that. And then later on, we're going to be putting timelines and theme rooms, one of which we hope will be possibly a semiconductor theme room. But the story that we want to tell, the story that's important to us over this weekend, is really about people just like you, right? Their innovation, persistence, failures, successes, lies, Little things, big things. It all tells the story of the environment and at its time, what really went on. You know, I've already heard some very interesting stories, and part of our job is to record those, which we are doing through this event with some unbelievable help of people that have put this whole thing together. I can't take credit for that, but David Laws, Jerry Hadley, Judy, and the rest of the team that have spent hours and hours for months and almost a year deserve a terrific round of applause. I can't say enough about working with people that have a passion, as passionate as we do, about preserving history. It really means a lot to us. And as co-chair of the Semiconductor Special Interest Group, which has been crafted for about 2 years and very active, my co-chair is Dave House, who's a very active member. Dave, you're here somewhere. Can't quite see. Dave House. We had a vision of really relating to semiconductors in terms of what that meant to the museum. And I think we've really embraced this vision, and we will tend to do so in the future. So thanks to a lot of hard work of many, we've been expanding our semiconductor presence, and I want to kind of just give you a little sense of some of the things that have been happening. Here you see Gordon Moore at one of our lectures in 2005, and I don't know who these handsome gentlemen are over here, but the same guys seem to show up everywhere. Have you noticed that? It's amazing. Cover of a magazine showed Leslie Berlin's work, highlight Leslie's work. And Leslie, are you here this evening? Wrote the book on Bob Noyce and wrote an article for our magazine. And we are really proud for this year's Fellow Award, a very special award that the museum has given since 1987. This is our 20th year. And its 4 fellows, Morris Chang from TSMC, Dave Patterson from UC Berkeley, John Hennessy from Stanford, and Chuck Thacker from Xerox PARC. Every single one of them are probably known in the community for incredible contributions to semiconductors. Semiconductors are really becoming alive at the Computer History Museum, as well they should. In addition, I also want to thank publicly the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, who has funded work for us, really using the idea of a transition to the integrated circuit as a catalyst for change in its use and application in education. You will see outcomes in the future in our timeline, and we just have hired a director of education, by the way, last week. He'll start on October 22nd, and we're really excited about that. And lastly, what you see in cyberspace, our website, you may be pretty excited about. I hope you will. It'll be a real treat. Here's our new homepage, by the way. And so our homepage points out something called the Silicon Engine. This is a timeline of history of semiconductors. And when you click on that, you come to some work that the Semiconductor Special Interest Group, David Laws, is really a catalyst to make all that happen, with a lot of other people, Michael Riordan and other folks that really make it special for us. So please think of us in your philanthropy, donations of artifacts and stories, and volunteering your time and wisdom as we build this museum to the really next level it needs and we are dedicated to be doing. Now we want to bring David Laws back on, our curator in the SIG, who really deserves credit for making a lot of things happen. David, thank you.
As John mentioned, the museum's next major project after the opening of the Timeline of Computing History exhibit in 2009 will be a series of technology theme rooms. And shortly after we started planning this celebration, over a year ago, a number of volunteers came up with the idea of raising funds to ensure that a semiconductor gallery gets high priority. We wanted ahead of the storage gallery and the software gallery and that other stuff. So I'm now going to invite Bob Presto. Bob is co-chair with Dick Cattell of the Silicon Industry Legacy Fund to update you on the progress they've made over the last year.
Well, you can see the progress we've made. We've been working on this 9 or 10 months. Dick Cattell, my co-chair, is right here. Was at Fairchild when I was there. We are still in the process of waiting for feedback on companies we've visited. You can see the names. I'm not going to repeat them. But a couple thanks here. We got the introductions to the CEOs of these companies through people in the room here that I want to thank. Dave House, George Wells, John East, George Scalise, and Stan Myers, who's not here, who's president of Semi. So they made the introductions, and then it was easy. And the thing that really helped us the most was the credibility of the Moore Foundation having already contributed to the museum. The next phase, that lead gift is always so important. The next phase is we're going to the Fabless Semiconductor Association, the EDA for the software people, to also contribute here in terms of the corporate CEOs. And then the next phase after that will be to go after individual contributions. Thanks very much.
John already thanked all the volunteers. As he mentioned, dozens of people have put in hundreds of hours of work to bring this session to happen today. And I just can't name them all, there are too many. But I would like to point out the indefatigable nature of the crew of volunteers we have. Ed Posser, over here on our left. Ed's been working very hard putting a panel together, and Ed broke his neck while surfing last week in Hawaii. I mean, the first question you ask is, how you doing, Ed? The second you ask is, what's a guy that age doing surfing? But I guess it tells you something about the nature of people that worked at Fairchild. So thank you so much, Ed, for coming here and putting up with that. So for tonight's presentation, we wanted to put together a group of alumni who went on to leading roles in the industry to tell us about their tenure at the company and how they felt about how Fairchild technology contributed to Silicon Valley and the worldwide semiconductor industry. Fairchild produced such an extraordinary crop of engineers, scientists, educators, business leaders, that narrowing the list down to a manageable number of participants wasn't easy. There were many we would have loved to have heard from tonight. Unfortunately, some of the most eminent have moved on to higher office. Others were not able to join us tonight for health or for personal reasons, but this slide shows just a few of the personalities that came to mind. Sherman Fairchild, inventor, playboy, chairman of Fairchild Camera Instrument, would surely have had some wonderful tales to tell us. Bob Noyce, scientist, visionary, mentor, nominated as a Nobel Prize winner before his untimely death shortly before its announcement, charmed everybody with his engaging personality and brilliant mind. We actually made contact with the hard-driving first marketing executive of the company, Tom Bay, to ask him to participate before he unfortunately left us early this year. Tough as nails, no-nonsense manufacturing legend, Charlie Sport couldn't join us tonight, but will be at the reunion gala tomorrow, I understand. And finally, Les Hogan, Harvard professor, Bell Labs researcher. He invented a number of important microwave devices, gyrators, and other important elements that remain in use today. Architect of Motorola's rise to prominence in the semiconductor business before joining Fairchild, and widely recognized as a leader, educator, and mentor. Les could unfortunately not be here tonight, but he is represented here tonight by his wife, Audrey Hogan, who's over here in the front row. So Fairchild is a company of legend, and in his recent book, Bill and Dave, author Michael Malone compares the corporate cultures of HP and Fairchild. Michael, are you here tonight? Michael was invited, but maybe he wouldn't want to appear in front of this audience after I read these couple of paragraphs here. But as he says, Fairchild was a company of legend, perhaps the most extraordinary collection of business talent ever assembled in a startup company. If Fairchild had a corporate culture, it could only be described as volatility incarnate. Fairchild was a company as frat house, brilliant young engineers and marketers working long days and partying long nights. Luckily, I've expurgated some of the more libelous stuff here. The Fairchildren, as they would one day be called, stole each other's women, crashed cars, and started lifelong feuds and friendships. And somehow in the middle of it all, they managed to invent the integrated circuit, the defining product of the late 20th century, and in the process helped to create the modern world. So that's one view of the company. So I now invite Floyd Farmy to lead a panel discussion that may either confirm Michael's view or refute it. I'm fascinated to find out. Floyd was an early Fairchild marketing manager who went on to lead National Semiconductor, who served as Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Apple Computer, is a partner emeritus at Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield and Byers, and is co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, to introduce the other members of one of the most illustrious frat houses of all time. Floyd.
Thank you very much. It's hard to imagine how you would introduce this group of folks. They're all so well known, so I'm going to be very, very brief in the introductory remarks. I want to remind you that there are cards for questions on your seats. If you want to ask a question even during the time, if you'd pass those along to the side, and somehow David will figure out how to get them into my possession so we can answer any questions that you might have as the evening goes on. We've been asked to talk about legacy. And legacy, of course, talks about how things are handed down. What came out of Fairchild that is handed down, and of course we all know of many, many things. And I thought to kick off the discussion tonight, I'd turn to Gordon Moore, one of the founders, because one of the legacies of Fairchild, of course, is silicon. At the time, I got in the semiconductor business in 1959 at GE Semiconductor. And at that time, we were fooling around with germanium. Yes, we had some silicon, we had some gallium arsenide, we had some copper stuff, and et cetera, et cetera. How'd you decide on silicon, and how'd that all happen?
Well, I guess I have to blame Shockley for that. He decided that he would set up a company devoted to doing silicon. We spent enough time there to think, gee, that was a pretty good idea. We set up Fairchild. It was naturally the material that we considered. Bob Noyce told us we didn't know how lucky we were not seeing how easy germanium was by comparison. But silicon had a lot of potential advantages, and fortunately we were able to exploit them over the years.
And how'd you decide to come together to do your silicon thing? I mean, you must have been very happy at Shockley. I mean, it's a wonderful place.
Well, that's an oft-told story, I think. Shockley was an unusual personality.
Oh, really?
Very bright. My colleague Jay Lass once commented he thought Shockley could see electrons. He had a physical intuition for what was going on in these materials, but he had no idea what went on inside people. And the net result was he made an untenable atmosphere in which to work. So the group of us tried to go around him to a source of funding, Arnold Beckman, and see if we get Shockley a professorship at Stanford or something and have him as a consultant, have somebody else come in and run the company. After a few meetings, Beckman decided that he would stick with Shockley, and we learned that a bunch of young PhDs had a tough time pushing aside a new Nobel laureate. But we felt we burned our bridges so badly that we were going to have to go look for other jobs. Fortunately, caught up with Arthur Rock and a colleague at Hayden Stone, who convinced us we ought to set up our own company instead of just finding somebody to hire us, which was our original intention. And we said, okay, then we don't have to sell our houses. It sounded like a pretty good deal. That's how Fairchild began.
Thanks, Gordon. Jerry, let me turn to you. Obviously, everybody thinks of Jerry as the sales guru, which he certainly is, but how many are aware of the fact that he was recently elected to the National Academy of Engineering, became a recent member? Jerry? And not everyone gets into the NAE, let me tell you. But Jerry, as you reflect now on what Fairchild was like back in the those times, 60, 61, when you joined, what stands out in your mind?
Well, I guess what I remember the most, and I started thinking about this, is how young everybody was. When I joined Fairchild in 61, I was 24 years old. Gordon was 32. I think Bob Noyce and Charlie Spork were 34. Tom Bay was around 34. This was a really young group. And the belief of everybody was there was nothing we couldn't do. This was probably truer in the marketing organization and in R&D. But we tried to force R&D to do everything we wanted them to do, which caused some grief from time to time. But the realities were it was a really young company. Everybody was just full of energy. It was a 24/7 kind of environment, actually, and was growing so fast. I remember how I came to join Fairchild. I just want to tell that because I ran into someone I haven't seen in decades. Bob Major, who's here tonight, was the area manager in Chicago, and I was selling semiconductors for Motorola, and I guess I was giving Fairchild a pretty bad time because Motorola had this wonderful product called the 2N834 silicon epitaxial transistor that they couldn't deliver. But the specs were better than the stuff that Fairchild could deliver. But as many of you know, that never stopped me. So I was invited to go out to Mountain View, California, to interview by Bob Major. You know, he wanted to hire me, and I said I wasn't really interested. He said, well, we'll send you out there. You meet these people. You're going to love these people. And the reason I accepted the offer to go was because I was going to spend the weekend in Las Vegas, spend one night at Fairchild, and then go back to Las Vegas and have some fun and go back to real work, you know. Because I was working for Motorola, and at the time, Motorola was a legend in Chicago. I mean, they made car radios, and I grew up in Chicago, and I had a Motorola car radio, right? What was Fairchild? I didn't know what that was. Anyway, I got out here, and the rest, I just couldn't believe the quality of the people. I mean, I met Charlie Spork, I met Tom Day, I met Bob Noyce, and I got terribly drunk with Don Rogers. And Don Rogers was the sales manager, and very late at night at Tiburon Tommy's, he tried to close on me to would I accept the job offer. And to his amazement and chagrin, I said yes, as district sales manager in Los Angeles. Well, that was a problem because they were trying to hire me for Chicago, but anyway. I woke up the next morning in Don's guest room, and I was hired as the district sales manager in Los Angeles, much to the chagrin of the area sales manager in Los Angeles. But that's another story. But anyway, but it was a young place. People would move on it. It was dynamic, and decisions were made really quickly. And I didn't appreciate at the time how young everybody was. But if you think about it, you know, here's Gordon Moore, you know, this vendor, this visionary of Moore's Law, and he was 32 years old. Come on. Here it was, you know, on its way to being the most important company in Silicon Valley history.
The amazing thing about the Valley, virtually everything that started out here is started by people in their 20s. It's part of our legacy, I think, and Fairchild set that. They can write that one down, a 20s legacy. Wilf, you were trying to make those 834s that Jerry was selling, or were you? I don't know.
No.
But what was it like to compete with Fairchild back in those days?
Well, you know, Jerry raised the subject of the youth, right? Well, Charlie tried to hire me to run the materials department at Fairchild in '62. Now, you figure this out. I was 23 at the time. And he said, well, Norm Peterson is going to Hong Kong to run a new deal in Hong Kong. And so I came out, and I interviewed with Gordon. Bob Noyce wasn't around, so I couldn't see him. And, of course, but Charlie seemed so terribly old to me at the time. I mean, he was 32 with the big cigar, you know. And so I was quite enthused about it. So I went back to Phoenix, and I talked to Les Hogan, and he said, well, why would you want to go do this? And I said, well, I'll have profit and loss responsibility. I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded pretty good. So Les said, well, I'm making a change in the transistor department, and why don't you stay and you can have profit and loss responsibility and run silicon transistors? So as a 23-year-old, this sounded like a pretty good idea. So I almost came to Fairchild at that time. But as Jerry was saying, we'd made the decision, and you know, Leo Dwork, I don't think Leo's here tonight, but Leo Dwork was my new boss. And so he said, I do anything to help you on this thing. And I said, yep. Could you show me how to use a 576 curve tracer? So this is, I'm now supposed to be running this operation, and he has to show me how to use the HP curve tracing. So the next thing that we went into was, well, we're in deep yogurt. We got some great designs, and as Jerry said, we got great specifications, and the 834 is only one of them. We had the 2N2218, we couldn't make that. The 2219, we couldn't make that, and so on. And so my marketing guy was a guy called Gary Tooker, and he said, well, I guess you're another guy who isn't going to be able to make this stuff either. So eventually we figured out how to make it. But in reality, comparing Fairchild in the 60s with Motorola, it was almost like two ships passing in the night. There wasn't a tremendous amount, apart perhaps on the silicon transistor, because Motorola was very focused on manufacturing excellence. We had 16,000 people in one complex, just two buildings. And you always used to think, that, well, we've got 1,000 guys in the basement in the machine shop designing and making equipment, and Fairchild's got 1,000 guys in Palo Alto doing R&D. And we were convinced that automation and mechanization was going to win. And I don't think it was until '66 that George Scalise and I actually went to Asia to contemplate perhaps doing some assembly in Asia. And one of the big hidden strengths of Fairchild was the early decision to go with the jet age automation of accessing 8 and 10 cent an hour labor and bypassing all of this effort on automation, and I think that was tremendous leverage for the company. And I know when I finally got to Fairchild in '68, I was astounded at the level of sophistication of the Hong Kong operation. But I saw that as the two major differences with Fairchild and Motorola. Motorola was very focused on automation, mechanization, and of course we had a big discrete business. And Fairchild, I think even in the perhaps '64, was already losing interest in the discrete business. And the main focus was on integrated circuits.
Absolutely, yeah.
Whereas at Motorola, we just kept focusing on improving the transistors. And so you ended up with two entirely different strategies. And so there wasn't really kind of a competition as we understand it.
We don't have anyone on the panel that was directly involved. Obviously, Ed down here, Paul, was very involved with that offshore manufacturing thing. But do you recall anything about the decision to go overseas, Gordon? It was 1959, I think, that you put that first
It was
plan.
very early. My recollection is that Bob Noyce and some other people took a tour through Asia. They were looking at India in particular and came back through Hong Kong and got excited about the activity level in Hong Kong and sent a crew over there with the idea of setting up a facility, much to John Carter's chagrin, I believe.
Yeah.
And it was a very successful deal. This was a time when other people were automating. I remember once giving a talk where IBM was demonstrating their fancy, fully automated line. And I had just seen Intel's line that had Chinese girls going bloomp, 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 bloomp with epoxy on top of the devices. I think it was faster than IBM's line and certainly a heck of a lot cheaper.
Well, I was selling in those days, and I remember something that went on. First of all, if you're as old as I am, you remember there was once a company called Philco, and they made something called the MADT, the micro-alloy diffused transistor.
And Noyce developed it.
What?
Noyce developed it.
Well, they spent a fortune automating that so that they could make them one at a time, but very fast. Yeah. But the batch process just killed that. Motorola did a Mesa transistor in germanium, which replaced the MADT, and then eventually we at Fairchild replaced that with the silicon devices. But what's kind of interesting was, vis-a-vis Hong Kong, somewhere in the '63, '64 timeframe, I'm not sure exactly when, Newton Minow, who was the FCC chairman, edicted that all television sets had to have UHF channels. Up till then, it was, 2 through 13. So the solution was you had to have a UHF oscillator. And that's, got to be in the gigahertz range, and all of a sudden, tremendous market for this device. And, excuse me, the RCA had something called a New Vista. And at Fairchild, we had something which was called the 1211 internally. The 2N918 was the device type. Sold for about $150 to the military. We'll come back to the military, and thank God for them in those days. But at that time, this actually would do the job of a UHF oscillator, except it was selling for $150 to the military. So I went out. I was given the assignment of breaking into the consumer market for Fairchild, which was, selling green-painted transistors, which were rejects from the silver can transistors. And that was my job, was to go out and make a market for that. So I went around and I thought, wow, this is the terrific opportunity. Except RCA sold the New Vista, which was sort of a solid-state device, but not really, for $1.05. And that was supposed to be what it had to go for in order to break into this market. So I went back, kind of dejected, to California and sat down with Tom Bay, who was the director of marketing at the time, and told him this story. And he said, $1.05. How many are they going to buy? And tens of millions, hundreds of millions, ultimately. Oh, wow, pretty big business. Let's go talk to Bob. We went over to Bob Noyce's house, and the first thing I knew was he had a waterfall in the backyard, which I thought, that's unusual. And that's because somebody put a freeway up nearby, and he had to put a waterfall in so he wouldn't hear the freeway, actually. Now, most of the people I knew didn't put in waterfalls when somebody built a freeway nearby. They just turned the radio up, or something. But in any event, we sat down, and so Bob heard this story. And, of course, the truth was I didn't know anything about how much things cost in those days because I was a marketing guy. So, but they had these tiny little chips, and there were like so many on the wafer, and they were going to make bigger wafers, and the chips were getting smaller. And then they were going to put them in plastic in Hong Kong. And I thought, wow, you're going to put this thing in? And Bob says, well, what do we have to do? He says, $1.05. Yeah, let's go do it. And literally, the decision was made like that at Fairchild. Bob was the general manager at the time, and that was the decision was made. And I'm sure a lot of guys in manufacturing went absolutely nuts, but it turned out to be a fantastically profitable thing, and it brought Fairchild a tremendous amount of volume and honed their volume skills. And it's, but I think it's indicative of the legacy of Fairchild was why not? We can do this. Go ahead.
I remember that the device, the little black blob of epoxy on top of the thing. We had a market for the rejects, it turns out, in Hong Kong. We sold the rejects for eyes and teddy bears. That's probably where the profit came from.
The part I remember, Gordon, about that package was that this package also had another name among our competitors. It was called the flip-top box, if you recall, because if you put your fingernail between the bit of epoxy and that solid seal, it would flick off. Well, we were trying to break into Digital Equipment Corporation, and I was sent to the field. It was my first sales call, actually, as a salesman, or sales engineer, as we called them back in those days, 1964, at Digital Equipment. And we had carefully data logged all these PNPs, because they were committed to PNPs because they were coming off germanium, and we built some PNPs in these things. And we had data logged everything, all the specs and all this kind of stuff. We figured the whole thing out, and all the data was there, sheets of data. We presented with, I was in there with a guy named Pete Schink. Many of you maybe remember Pete. He was the guy I was taking over the account from. And the fellow takes our data log transistors, and I don't recall there were 25 or 50 of them in the package. He pours them out on his desk, and literally, in a Khrushchev act, takes off his shoe and starts beating on these things, okay, to see if the tops would come off. And all the tops came off, okay? In which case, all our data log is real valuable now, He scoops these things into his hand, and he sat, those of you who remember the old deck plant, it was over a mill pond. And he had a window over the mill pond. It went, whew. And I'm saying to myself, and I got a degree in semiconductor physics to do this, sell transistors to a guy who's going to beat on them. But so the flip-top was a great thing for transistors, but it was a toughie to sell.
How did you guys? we trained our salesmen to use their nail.
Yeah, that's
so they could do the demonstration to flip the. Yeah. We call them pop tops. We thought that was pop tops.
Yeah, okay.
But because we were doing with transfer molded plastic, and very tough to flip the top of things.
Yeah.
Well, I remember that at the time it was easier to sell the hermetic packages, but we sold a lot of those pop tops anyway. But one of the thoughts that which just popped into my mind, if you excuse the pun, is when I was calling on Hughes Aircraft Company, my first major account in Southern California, and they had a program called the Interceptor Improvement Program, the IIP, and they were going to put in these new fire control systems in the aircraft, and they had silicon, they had to have silicon, and it was all Texas Instrument grown junction. Now, that's an old technology, but we were selling planar transistors, as you'll recall, Gordon, and those planar transistors had very low leakage, and it was insensitive, relatively insensitive to temperature, whereas a grown junction, because there was surface leakage, when you would heat them up, the leakage would go up. And using one of those curve tracers, which I had learned to use at university, I'm just teasing you, you know that. I would show these guys, we'd put them in the prototypes, and I would hold a match to the grown junction devices, at which time the system would fail. But the planar transistors, you could hold a match right against it, no leakage change, all work fine. Beautiful. On a curve tracer, you just watch that grown junction thing fail. And I was thinking about, the observation you made, Floyd, that when the TI guy went back to Texas and said to these guys, this guy Sanders is setting fire to our transistors. And they thought he was lying to them. But anyway, we did get the IIP contract, and we sold it. Hughes became one of our largest customers. So life was simpler in those days. A little match here, a fingernail there, Yeah.
Gordon, one of the things that people, of course, today talk a lot about, and certainly we had an illustration of this, if I can go to a slightly more serious subject for just a moment, of course, is this whole issue of immigration. And, all this, H-1Bs and all that kind of stuff. But as I remember, Fairchild R&D that you ran, if you didn't understand foreign accents, you were in trouble. How'd that all happen?
You can blame our graduate schools on that, I suspect. We hired the best people we could find coming out of school. A lot of them turned out to be immigrants that have come here fairly late in life and therefore had strong accents.
And there were a lot of them. I mean, it was so this the fact that immigrants built Silicon Valley or had a large role in building Silicon Valley goes back to the early 60s, doesn't it?
And it still continues.
And it continues, of
I
course.
remember once at Intel, Condi Rice came down to visit me when she was at Stanford. She says, wow, this is like going to the United Nations.
It was.
Yeah.
Well, Fairchild R&D was like that. I mean, I recall many of the guys there.
I wish you would have gone to the United Nations a little more.
Yeah, right. Now, let me ask, why the heck did I bring that up? No, Wilf, you came to Fairchild in '68. Obviously, a lot of us had fled the scene. Mm-hmm. What was it like then?
Some amount of chaos. Well, Jerry was still there.
That's right.
He was the stability.
Yeah.
At the time.
The Rock.
Yeah, the Rock.
No, but I mean, the problem is that you'd had Charlie in '66. He left, and then he ripped out a huge amount of management. And then and you helped. And then in when was it, Gordon? Early '68.
'68, yeah.
And then Intel, of course, took a whole new chunk of the company, and so the company really had very little. The original management left. I mean, Ed Porter was still there, and so Asia was doing okay, and so on. But a lot of people had been abruptly ripped out in two waves, and so there was a certain amount of chaos. And but there was a tremendous amount of products that, I remember Jerry's. What was it? The product a week or the product a month?
Program, yeah.
And so on. This like huge number of products. Of course, they couldn't be made, but they and I remember Gordon's great comment at that time that he said, "At Intel, we've been able to demonstrate that you really can transfer products from Palo Alto to Mountain View."
Yeah.
Because Intel's set up in Mountain View. So, but I'm sure you remember that comment, right? But it was really, the issues really, making things. And I mean, the amazing thing to me was the difference between when I got to Hong Kong and John Sussenberger was running the Hong Kong plant. And I was very frustrated because I really couldn't get good data in Mountain View on what's our cost and so on. And I went off in a little bit of a tirade in John Sussenberger's office about, I don't know what the cost is. And he said, well, what do you want to know? Would you like to know what it cost us to make that transistor on the third shift last night? I said, yeah. So he reaches in his desk. No computers. Everything is beautifully handcrafted. And he had the exact data. And it was with a latency of hours, literally. And we didn't have anything like that in Mountain View. So the systems, which in the U.S. should have been somewhat computerized, really weren't very good. And so we had lots of delinquencies, service issues. When I talk to when you transition from companies, there's a moment in time when you know the exact prices for specific deals. Connie Pasqua is here tonight, and he was running purchasing at Control Data at the time. And that was one price that I knew exactly. And I asked the sales guy, well, why did you cut the price this much? And he said, well, our delivery is so lousy that we got to do something. So it's called low price, and so on. So there was a lot of logistics problems right here in the U.S., which had been largely eliminated in the Hong Kong plant, which was really your humming sort of plant. And the surprising thing to me was that we were manufacturing, 1 million transistors a day in Phoenix, fully automated, and the actual cost of those little pop-top things was about the same as what our cost was in Phoenix, which was like radical to me. And I remember at the time trying to persuade, my automation guys, Bill Lehner's group, we got to pick it. We're doing the right thing. We just got to pick it up and put it in Hong Kong. And they said, no, we're going to do it here. I mean, this is the sort of thing that you get a lot of CNN people today advocating this is what you should do today, and you'd get killed if you did this. But really, that manufacturing machine that we had in Hong Kong, and also in Korea, actually, it was something that was a joy to behold. If you could have somehow got a lot of the logistics solved in the U.S. Now, and I don't know whether that was because of the turnover of management that had happened.
I'd like to jump in on that. I remember the 66 to 68 time frame very well, because when Charlie Spork resigned, I was stunned. I mean, to me, Fairchild was a family. Everybody was together. I'd been there for a few years. I was living in Northern California, and all of a sudden, Charlie Spork, the general manager, resigned. Bob Noyce had been elevated to a group vice president role, and Charlie Spork was kind of the guy running the day-to-day activity. And I went in, and I was like with the White Sox or the Black Sox, shoeless Joe Jackson, say it isn't so, Joe. And Charlie had, I said, you can't be doing this, this is your home, this is the family, blah, blah, blah. And, Charlie basically just went off on the incompetent corporate management back in Syosset, which took me aback because I saw those guys as just a bunch of suits that came down every once in a while, and everybody took them to lunch, and then they went away. But Charlie told me it was a lot tougher to handle than that, and it's interesting because there were two of them, Dick Hodgson, who I thought was a terrific human being, and John Carter, who I did not. But I didn't know as much about John Carter and the difficulties that Charlie had, and Charlie just said, I just can't work here anymore. I just got to be my own man. I'm leaving. But he, as you say, Wilf, he took basically all the key manufacturing managers, because those were his people. They were his, his boys, so to speak. In those days, it was mostly boys. So he just took everybody. So National became a manufacturing powerhouse. And he got recruited over there by Bob Weidler, who was a brilliant linear engineer, had a design capability, but they couldn't make these linear devices very well at National, so he persuaded Charlie to come over there with his team, and so all of a sudden National was a major factor in the business. It wasn't too long after that you defected and left and went over there.
I went with
I mean,
Charlie.
I tried to keep you, but I love Bob Noyce. He's a mentor and hero to me. But I knew when he called you Cloyd during the try to re-recruit you that we were dead. There was a Cloyd Marvin there, who may be in the audience.
And Cloyd's
tonight.
here.
Yes, he Cloyd. Well, great guy. But anyway, but Floyd left. So now we had a little manufacturing issue, and we were trying to sell things to people like RCA, and we couldn't make this stuff, and we couldn't test it. And then I found out from Tom Bay, who succeeded Charlie as a general manager, which was probably not the best choice, as it turned out, because we needed a manufacturing guy in there, and Tom was a brilliant marketing guy, but we couldn't make this stuff, and we didn't have enough money for testers. And Syosset wouldn't send money over for testers. Now, Gordon, you may know more about than I did, but they just were tight as a bull's ass in fly time with money. And so you just weren't getting any money. And as a sales guy, we weren't even 100% testing this stuff. And the answer was, well, they'll test it at RCA and they'll send back what doesn't work. Well, I can understand Gordon's frustration. And after the fact, as I understand it, Gordon, you were the guy that actually said, you just weren't happy with the time it took to get your wonderful new stuff into production and out into the marketplace. And that you were the guy that actually was probably the guy who really started the idea of Intel. And Bob said, you're right, Gordon, let's do something. Is that accurate or close?
Not quite. No, when Bob was getting passed over to be the next CEO of Fairchild, he decided he was going to leave. When he had approached me with the possibility earlier, and I said, no, I got the best job in the industry. But when I found out he was leaving and management was coming in from outside that I didn't think I'd like to change, I said, okay, I'll go too.
Okay. Well, you're never too old to learn something. I just learned something.
Jerry, you mentioned something earlier I'd like us to talk about a little bit. People talk about drivers in the industry today. Of course, cell phones a driver for the industry. PCs were a driver. You mentioned military as a driver. Was it a driver?
Oh, tremendous. At Autonetics, there was the Minuteman program, and I think that it was probably the largest contributor of Fairchild's early growth, making the 696 and 697, which was the workhorse transistor in the Minuteman 1. Unfortunately, the military is a very tough taskmaster, and if you left yourself just to that, you would, I think, been relegated to a secondary supplier because the volumes weren't large, the specifications were tough.
But my recollection is in like 66, 40+% of our business was Mil-Aero, wasn't it?
Oh, I'm sure it was. As a matter of fact, but it ranged from space programs. We were actually supplying some micrologic, the RTL micrologic, as you recall, to MIT for the Apollo. And that was a very rough program. I mean, it took a lot of engineering excellence to do that.
The paper far outweighed the devices.
The paper far out, exactly. And when it came time to do Minuteman 2, out of insanity, Texas Instruments bid an RCTL solution, which had capacitors on there, which were very difficult to make and control. But basically all they did was take a simple, discrete solution for the system, clump them into what they thought would be a manageable number of devices to put on a chip, and that became basically the specs. And we at Fairchild tried very, very hard to convince these guys that this was not a reasonable approach. And the Minuteman 2 program was delayed. It was horrendously expensive, but it put Fairchild in a trailing position. And then I think, was it about that time that Jay Last left, went over to Signetics and did DTL?
It was a little before that, I think.
A little before that,
yeah.
But in that whole time frame, the military was key. But as Gordon says, on those space programs, I mean, you'd have to provide a little notebook with each device, read and record, burn it in some more, read and record, burn. It was not a great way to make money. And Tom Bay, to his eternal credit, said, we've got to get into the consumer market. We've got to get the computer market. The computer market we were making some forays in with the 2N2369, 2N914 switching.
And a lot of custom stuff.
And there was some custom stuff.
A lot of custom stuff.
And of course, we had the incredible CTL. Bob Seeds, Dr. Seeds, a genius, came up with a technology called CTL, and Burroughs adopted it, and it was a huge, huge success. But unfortunately, it was a one-customer product.
Yep.
And thank God, when I started AMD, after being fired ignominiously from Fairchild, Technically, I wasn't fired, but come on. You know. I was approached by some guys to do CTL, and I said, I'd never do CTL. You know, I mean, but they need a second source. I said, well, second sourcing is cool, but there's only one customer. I want to do the TTL. I want to do the MSI stuff, because at that point in time, Fairchild had changed management, and they were de-emphasizing the proprietary, brilliant market system segmentation we had developed to replace it by being a TTL second source supplier to TI Series 5474 Wretch and Vomit. Awful. Which is why I got fired, because I didn't exactly keep that to myself.
But you know, Floyd, before you leave the military thing,
Sure, go ahead.
in the early '60s, there was so much crap associated with the military that you had to say, is this really worth it? And I remember going to the finance people at Motorola and saying, look, let's really understand this, and let's break out all the costs associated with doing military business. And then we'll really understand what it is. So they broke it all out very neatly. And once we saw the numbers and we looked at the bottom line, we said, no, put it all back together again. We don't want to know. Because the profits for the military were very high. It's just that the nuisance level was so high.
Yeah.
But if you actually look at the profits, you say all of the other stuff we were just breaking in even on, and that went on into like the mid-'60s.
Yeah.
Well, if you think about it, you know, I was the sales guy at Raytheon for the Apollo computer. A dual 3-input NOR gate for the Apollo sold for $9.90, and we were selling everywhere else for 99 cents. So it was a 10x.
Yeah.
It was a 10x deal. That was a big delta. Well, you know, talk about the integrated circuit thing. Going back to something we were talking about earlier, Gordon, how confident were you that ICs were going to work? I mean, this whole notion of putting the whole thing on the chip. The early chips, let's face it, they weren't as good as. I mean, CDC, for example. I remember. He didn't buy into it, right? What's his name?
Well, Seymour Cray.
Seymour Cray. He never did buy into integrated circuits
Never
forever.
did.
They use AMD today.
What's that? At AMD he did finally?
No, they use AMD.
No,
Seymour's not around
Back then, I remember he was vehement. He wanted discrete transistors. I mean, what was going through your head? You were running R&D.
Well, unfortunately, he wasn't the only potential customer.
Yeah.
But in the early days, integrated circuits didn't get widely accepted. You know, the people concerned about reliability argued that they couldn't measure the value of the resistors, they couldn't look at the transistor parameters, and all kinds of reasons why they couldn't use them. And as I mentioned last night, Noyce came up with a solution to that. He says, we'll sell them to you for less than you can buy the components to build them yourself.
Exactly
and that
right.
made a real change in the market.
That's exactly right.
Of course, it was a lot less than it cost us to build them, too.
Well, those are startup costs, Gordon. You got to do that.
Well,
No, I remember that because Bob Graham was a brilliant marketing guy, rest his soul. Bob always was making the pitch of how much you were saving by the backplane wiring and all these things, and he put this cost together, and then he'd cut 20% off and show them how they were saving money. But until the bill of materials cost went below it, and that will, you credit Bob Noyce, I'll second that, till the bill of materials cost went below the other bill of materials cost, they just didn't catch on. There was a million reasons and a million excuses, but it was just like selling transistors to the consumer. You know, once there was something called AGC for UHF device, you know, and it turns out the forward characteristics of transistors aren't as good as the forward characteristics of a pentode tube. Once the prices got where they were cheaper than a pentode tube, nobody gave a rat's anything about that. You know, and suddenly, you know, you didn't see too many shirt pocket tube radios. Let's face it. You know.
No, but on the, you know, and Connie Pax was here as well, but CDC was on the same thing, that they could not get this performance of the computer. And, I mean, and we kind of split that business between Motorola and Fairchild. And there was 1.5 million transistors, which were ECL.
Right.
So they're always on. Now, it's only a little 10 milliwatts per transistor. But by the time you do that, you've got a 4,000 amp bus bar in the middle of the computer that you've got to pour Freon through it to just absorb all of this heat, you know. So, but he couldn't get the speed any other way at that time. Now, I'm sure 5 years later you could have done it with integrated circuits, but at the time that he wanted it. So.
You know, from a process point of view, Gordon, a thing I remember was when I first arrived, I'll never forget my very first week. I shared an office with Murray Siegel. I haven't seen Murray's, but he was having an allocation meeting for the S elements, which was the most complex part of the RTL, if you recall. And that week's production was, I still remember this, 7 pieces. And we had a backlog. My recollection is it was like 2,000 pieces in the backlog, okay? And they were arguing about whether they should give 1 to each of 7 customers or whether AIL should
Long
get
Island,
2 because they had the largest amount of the backlog, okay? The 2 pieces versus the other things. And then, to me, the marvelous thing that happened was epitaxy. Because yields suddenly went from 1 per 5 starts, wafer starts, 1 chip per 5 wafer starts, because that was the S yield,
No, that was a major breakthrough in the technology. Before that, we did this isolation, diffusing all the way through the wafer from both sides. And you had to make very thin wafers, 3 mils thick. And they came out of the furnace looking like potato chips. You could hardly work with them. And epitaxial got away from that whole deal. That really was a process step that made integrated circuits practical.
Because that's really what made it possible to go to that 99-cent part.
Well, if you didn't have them to ship, you could sell them for 99 cents.
Exactly.
It didn't make any difference.
No, but I've always thought that epi was the big deal.
That was a real saver.
The other problem you had, Jerry, and maybe you could comment on this, I remember visiting a guy named Carl something or other who was the chief engineer at Zenith. Bernie would know his name. And we were trying to sell him on our transistors and on our stuff, and he wasn't buying. And we kept saying, well, what does the price have to be? And he says, you realize you're competing with free. And we said, could you explain that to us? He said, you understand, we make most of our business on tubes from replacement. And so the manufacturers of the tubes give them to us. You're competing with free. And of course, Sony was eating their lunch by that time because theirs were more reliable sets because they were transistors and all. But that was a big problem. I mean, I don't know if you recall that. Bernie, I'm sure, recalls it.
I remember spending an awful lot of time in screen rooms at Zenith, and Admiral and all those places. I hate screen rooms. All that copper around me smells bad. I don't remember that's the particular deal, but the whole concept, hand-wired, which is what Zenith's pitch was. Well, it only took a while to figure, well, what's good about that? But it is interesting. I think the point you make, and maybe this is part of the legacy of Fairchild, it was, to make the technology available to a wider and wider base by driving the cost down. Thank the Lord for a phenomenon known as Moore's Law. That as you push the technology, you can make more and more for less and less. So you can make everything for nothing, right, Gordon?
Absolutely.
But it really has been. That's what's driven the industry. If you look at the charts, where you're putting, ever more devices and ever more functionality, and that's the legacy of Fairchild. It started that, the ring and dot transistor, the planar transistor, batch processing killed the automated stuff. When these guys came over from Motorola, they set up an automated line for a while, but it wasn't very long. But they figured the future was ICs, and Wilf had drove that, and that's what it was all about. Getting more and more for less and less.
How long did you think Moore's Law was going to last?
When?
In 1965, when you first came up with it.
The first paper, I was only asked to predict 10 years.
Yeah.
So 75 was all I was looking at.
Yeah. And it actually you didn't quite say 18 months. You said what?
I said every year.
Every year, right.
So for the first 10 years. And that would have been 10 doublings, and we got 9, I think.
Yeah.
It was pretty close.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I published an article in 75 saying it was going to change to more like every 2 years because we lost one factor. because there was a lot of waste space to squeeze out of the early integrated circuits. So we got density by squeezing out isolation and such. But in 75, we had CCD devices that were active area packed right against one another. There was nothing left to squeeze. So that was about half the contribution of the complexity.
We have a question from the audience that asks the question, what was the minimum feature size of the first Fairchild integrated circuit? Do you remember?
God, I ought to.
I remember
My
we used to,
recollection, it was 25 microns, a mil.
I remember you could see them with the bare eye.
Yeah.
You know, you'd
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was 25 microns.
25 microns.
Wow.
And then one of our early spin-offs, Signetics, went off to do the same kind of thing, and they were taking the next generation of technology, making it a half a mil, 12.5 microns.
Remember, we used to deal in mils at that time.
Yeah, sure.
Thousandth of an inch.
Yeah, we lived,
And, yeah.
you know, loved the old English days.
Right.
Yeah. Well, 10th mil was a big deal, I remember, when we got to 10th mil, wouldn't it? So would that be
2.5 microns.
2.5 microns? Yeah, that was a very, very, and that was later, of course, but that was
Much later.
that was a very, very big deal. So, Jerry, you had to be an engineer to be a salesman at Fairchild. Why was that?
Well, actually, you didn't have to be, and a lot of them weren't. I changed that when I was in charge.
Okay.
And I didn't mean that to be harsh, but the realities were, when I worked for Motorola, first as an applications engineer, and then as a sales engineer, the first thing I figured out was that the sales guys who worked for Motorola at the time were just old tube salesmen or waveguide salesmen or connector salesmen, Amphenol salesmen. There's a great Amphenol salesman in the audience today, Steve Zelenzik, one of my great success stories in sales. And he's an engineer, by the way, and that's why he's eligible. But at the time, they were just sales guys, and it was a components business. And that's really the difference as time has passed in our industry. You were selling a component, there was a spec, did you meet the spec, you bid price and delivery, they did some testing. But what I figured out early on was you had to show the guy what, it's been my mantra for 50 years, how are you different, how are you better? And in order to know how you're different, how you're better, you really have to know the ins and outs of the device. So when I was a sales guy at Fairchild, I was quite successful, maybe not just because of lighting matches against TI transistors, but explaining to guys how this thing worked, why it was superior, why it was better than what the other guy did, why it would last longer. And I began to, then I was made sales manager nationwide. I edicted that everybody had to have an engineering degree. Actually, it was worse than that. I said an electrical engineering degree. But if the guy really hit me right, had a great personality, I'd settle for mechanical engineering or aeronautical engineering. I never went for a civil engineer, I don't think, though.
Is it true, the story that went around about you, that if you were interviewing a guy for a sales position, and he asked about the retirement program, the interview stopped?
I don't think I ever gave him a chance to talk.
No.
Actually, I don't remember that, but I certainly would not have hired the guy. It turns out, in those days, I had a pretty damn good memory, so I had a pretty good handle on what the guy was all about and where he was from when I met him and actually sat down with him. And I was just interested in the energy and his persuasiveness. I mean, if the guy had an engineering background and he had a track record, but was he persuasive? And if he wasn't persuasive, he wasn't going to be on our team. Didn't want him there.
The other story about you on sales guys and hiring was that you always had the guy take you for a ride.
Always.
Had to be a wild driver.
Right. Aggressive, I use
aggressive
the word. Aggressive driver.
Okay. Aggressive driver.
Aggressive driver.
Yeah,
An
accident
would have disqualified him, but aggressive was good.
Yes, okay, good.
But while we're at one, the one thing that I learned later that people really were annoyed with, I didn't realize, when I started out at Fairchild, I was single. So the concept of home life and family meant nothing to me. So I just worked. And I would be up very early in the morning, and I would go around the sales guys' houses at 7:30 in the morning or 8 o'clock in the morning, as I was more polite, knock on the door. They were home. They were in dead meat. They had to be on the street calling on customers. And I'd also always check the trunks of their cars. And they had to have an adequate supply of catalogs, data sheets, and application notes for what we were pushing. Otherwise, again, we didn't want them.
Yeah.
But you know, the realities were Fairchild had a great product line, and the numbers were so small in those days. You know, the last year that I was there, I think the goal for the year was $120 million. I mean, these are mice nuts kind of numbers today, you know? Now, you know, I mean, you start a new company with $1 billion, right? I mean, or Facebook or something, you know, if it's social networking, probably $2 billion to start. But in those days, wow, $100 million was huge. You know, so a $10,000 order was a big deal. And so the sales guy was really, really key. And I think that we had a great team of people because Fairchild had such a great product that very smart engineers recognized this is the place they wanted to be.
What was your take on the sales force when you got here, compared to what you had at Motorola?
Well, I was pretty brainwashed, actually, because within Motorola, the Fairchild sales force was referred to as the suede shoe boys. I never quite understood what it meant, but I mean, certainly with some of the, like your old friend Ray Kimball,
Yeah.
that said it all, the suede shoe boys. And I said, well, I got a pair of suede shoes, you know. But I really was surprised. It took about 30 days. You know, I mean, I remember George Scalise and I were both going through the same thing at the same time. After about 30 days, we said, hey, this sales force is great. These guys, on average, are 10 years younger than the Motorola sales force. They know their stuff. They think strategically and so on. And I think that actually drove the product development. I mean, at Motorola, because we had a big parent, a lot of the consumer products was really dictated by one division or another division of Motorola. So that a lot of your product lines were more or less evolving with your big customer and the people they compete with. So it was somewhat different to have people that were shooting ahead of the target, and the marketing guys had a totally different role than they did at Motorola, because they would actually kind of have ideas and say, this is what the guy's going to need next, and we're going to sell it. And that was very impressive to me at the time.
Well, I'd like to interject that at the time when I first met Wilf, I felt I'd met a kindred spirit, although that might surprise many of you, but Wilf and I hit it off right away. He tried to keep me from getting fired. He told me to keep my mouth shut. I didn't. I was. But I would say this, that it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me as it worked out, because otherwise I wouldn't have started AMD. But maybe one of the nicest things, Audrey, was a few years later when Les was asked me to participate in dedicating the engineering building at Berkeley. And he introduced me by saying, this is Jerry Sanders. I fired him. It was the biggest mistake I ever made. And that made me feel real good. Thank you.
The sales meetings, Jerry, obviously they were a big part of being part of Fairchild Semiconductor back in those days. I don't know that other companies had the extravaganzas that we had. I think that might also be a legacy of Fairchild Semiconductor.
Well, I think it is, but I'd like to give credit for that to Don Valentine. If you remember, Don, as you probably know, has been a fabulously successful venture capitalist, and probably too wealthy to be here tonight. But Don.
What are you doing here, Gordon? No, I'm sorry.
As I recall, the first year I was at Fairchild, which was 1961, and I can't remember whether it was at the end of 61 or the beginning of 62, but the first sales meeting, and Don at the time Don Valentine was not the sales manager, was at the Altamira in Sausalito. And it was pretty good. We shared rooms, which was not so great, and not with girls, actually, with ourselves, with other guys. When Don Rogers went over to run marketing and sales for SGS, after Fairchild had made an arrangement with SGS, the Italian company.
No. SGS.
SGS. Don Valentine was promoted to sales manager, and he actually started the sales meetings in beautiful places like Puerto Rico, Bermuda, Acapulco, and then Hawaii, and then I jumped on Hawaii, and Hawaii was I made that my own for about 15 or 20 years until, I didn't make it my own. But it was a special thing. It was all about motivating the sales force. And, I used to say that a successful salesman has product knowledge on fire. Product knowledge, that's why you had to be an engineer. You had to know your stuff, like you did, Floyd. You were a guru in the IC stuff before I even could quite figure out why it all worked and did I care. Yeah. And then I figured out, yeah, I do, big time. But the other thing was the sales force just had that camaraderie, that bonding, because what I found, and many of you probably have worked in sales organizations or with them, everybody's always fighting for their commission. Everybody got designed in here, but it got shipped there, and it got produced there, and they're all fighting over the commissions. What I wanted, guys, was just a fight to get the business. And when you're all playing on a volleyball team in the sands of Hawaii, or you're in a marathon or some sort, you build a camaraderie and a togetherness that you just care about winning the business, winning the design. And I thought that's what the sales conference was about. The fact that we had the largest bar bill at the Hilton Hawaiian Village of any company was testimony to the ability of these young guys to drink. But as Bob said, they really worked hard. They got a lot of business.
I was showing Jerry and some of the guys, I found this a year ago. Here is the notebook from the Hawaii 1964 National Sales Conference, Fairchild Semiconductor, founded about a year ago. That was quite a conference. Gordon, a question for you from the audience. And I'm going to slightly rephrase the question a little bit, because the question as it reads is, how much was luck and how much was skill? Can you talk about what areas you look back on now and say, man, that was a lucky choice?
Oh. The Fairchild, some of these things that came along, the planar transistor obviously was very nice. It came along when it did. It was a step in the direction of the technology that the industry has grown on ever since. I think the fact that Fairchild started in the technology areas have turned out to be the ones that were continued. We developed the first manufacturing use of diffusion, photolithography, a variety of these things that...
and you had to make the equipment yourself, right?
We had to make the equipment, but the direction we wanted to go, batch producing transistors initially, required these things to work. So our direction was relatively clear, so we solved the problems.
I've heard you talk, though, about the choice of an NPN versus the PNP initially. Was that a lucky choice?
No, that was an obvious choice. The NPN was a better transistor and easier to make than the PNP. It's just that the PNP had a very strong advocate in Jean Herny, who never liked to lose any contest, and his PNP got placed on the back burner for a while while the NPN went into production.
So it was because of what? Surface physics and the...
No, just the electrons move faster through the base and the NPN. Aluminum works on both emitter and base without having to do anything special. It was a much more straightforward process.
As you look at your history, luck versus skill.
Modesty forbids a reply.
If you had asked me about Intel, I would have said luck was an extremely important part of it. We started out pursuing 3 technologies for semiconductor memory, and I call it our Goldilocks strategy. One of them was going to be a multi-chip assembly of MOS memory chips with bipolar drivers, and we couldn't do the multi-chip assembly. That was too hard. The other one was a twist on bipolar, the aluminum Shockley, and that worked so well, everybody making TTL picked it up right away. We didn't have an advantage. The silicon gate MOS turned out to be just right.
Yeah.
While we were focused on solving the problems, we got by the 2 or 3 pretty tough steps relatively straightforwardly. But the big guys didn't get turned around. We essentially had a monopoly on silicon gate for 7 years.
Yeah.
And that was extremely important. If silicon gate had been somewhat harder, we might have run out of money and not had something Makes sense. If it been much easier, we would have had competition sooner. So that was luck. It got us off to that great start.
What's the luckiest thing then? Let me ask the question that happened to you, Jerry.
Well, actually, it turns out my grandfather always said it'd be better to be lucky than smart. I think the luckiest thing was that somewhere early on, and I recognized that way the technology was going, that you'd be able to do more and more on the chip. And so when I started AMD, based on the knowledge I'd had from Fairchild about the MSI devices, that you're going to be building more complex LSI devices. And of course, at the time, Intel was building memories, and that was an obvious LSI device. What wasn't so obvious, other than custom circuits, which everybody tried, but that didn't seem to be the best solution, was what is going to be the functionality. So when I started AMD, I came up with this expression, building blocks of ever-increasing complexity to increase the performance, reduce the cost, and speed the time to market for OEMs of computation and communications equipment.
Man, is that punchy?
But I was new. I mean, I couldn't shorten to a sound bite. I mean, that was it. I said, okay, just building more and more complex devices. The lucky thing was that since I started out as an alternate source, and I was alternate sourcing Motorola's best stuff, TI's best stuff, National's best stuff, Intel's best stuff, I figured out early on that it had to be MOS, because you were going to be able to put more functionality on than you were with bipolar power dissipation. So that was I think, kind of smart. And then these guys came out with a 2-bit wide bit slice microprocessor. 2 bits wide, but you could string them together, and so you made your own microcode. You could do whatever you wanted. Sure. You remember this, you put the micro in the PROM. So I thought, okay, we'll do that with 4 bits. And we did a 4-bit wide, and we kicked their butt. Probably the only time for a long time until very recently. But I think again, that's what makes Silicon Valley great, is competition. So I think the luckiest thing I ever did was to sign a cross-licensing technology agreement with Intel, because they were bigger and spending more on microprocessors, and I knew and I saw that the microprocessor was the end-all building block of ever-increasing complexity. And from that day forward, we have been building ever-increasing. Now we have the only native core, quad core, with hundreds of millions of transistors, and there's more. We'll throw the graphics thing on there. So the building block of ever-complexity thing, long as that statement was, it's still applicable.
Wilf, Luck, what role?
Well, when I was running the epitaxy group at Motorola, I was invited to TI, and I go to TI, and I said, well, I'd be really interested to see what you're doing in epitaxy. And they said, no, I can't really do that. But we'll show you how we make our silicon, our polysilicon. So I said, sure, I'm a chemical engineer, I'd be interested in that. So they had a column there. And I said, gee, how do you got this 50-foot column, how do you line that with pure quartz? And they said, well, we don't. I said, what do you mean? They said, oh, well, we just pickle it. And so we just have stainless steel, and we just run, and we get 100 ohm centimeter at the bottom. And I remember saying, I have to get an Elliott plane. And I went back to Phoenix and said to my guys, go build a system to run epitaxy with stainless steel, and the only piece of quartz is going to be the tube. And they said, I think you're crazy. No, because the contamination. And I said, look, we got more contamination from the grease and these little, trying to seal up these quartz tubes. And, I mean, that was the luckiest thing, because up to then we were committed to doing everything with bits of quartz, which was a mess to make a manufacturing system. And that's probably the luckiest thing I ever got into.
As you think about today, and maybe I'll start with Wolf again. As you think about today and think about lessons learned back in those very early days, what applies today as you look at it? I mean, we're talking about legacy. We're talking about things that we launched from the Fairchild days. As you think about today's business, what's applicable in your mind?
I think you got to see the trends and you got to move faster. You know, I mean, I mentioned that Fairchild saw the idea of using Asia and the big differential in labor rates between Asia and the U.S. very, very early, and they executed on it. And it wasn't just Motorola that was slow. Everybody else was slow. Japanese was slow. Because of that decision, the disk drive guys, who all, one way or another, had their seeds in the semiconductor business in the valley here, they very quickly went to Asia. And so Japanese had the same idea of automation. And so by the time the Japanese figured out how to get their automatic line, suddenly you're now doing 3.5-inch disks. And then they'd go away and they'd spend a couple of years automating that. And by the time they got to that, the disk drive guys went 2.5. And so I think seeing things like that and then moving on them quickly, early, I think that's the lesson. And you notice how quickly people jumped on the fabless model, and many people, starting companies, didn't do that. And if they had, they would have been much more successful.
You know, we're talking about legacies, and you remind me of one thing, if you wouldn't mind commenting on, or maybe I'll turn to Jerry on this. I kind of have the feel that the fact that we went to Asia from a manufacturing point of view helped the Valley have a global view from its very, very earliest days. You buy that?
Well, it's interesting. I was fortunate enough to know Dave Packard, and he asked me to go with him back to Washington to testify before Congress about this transfer of jobs for assembly over to, the Far East, and how we were, destroying all these U.S. jobs. And, of course, we then had to research the impact, and it became pretty clear that having this lower cost capability, which allowed us to drive larger shares of market and, do more business, meant more R&D engineers, more marketing and sales people, more, wafer fabrication people. So in reality, by using a global approach to driving costs down, and today we do it with design centers around the world, yeah, I think so. I think that but that comes back, what's that old line, a good idea doesn't care who had it. Going offshore to get low-cost assembly and going offshore just so you could get the assembly done, because it wasn't easy to hire wire bonders. And in those days, I think we started out at Fairchild, we used those wedge bonders, and we had the purple plague, and God, there were nightmares there. So having, a lower-cost solution, and the global approach, I think that's it. And that's the legacy of Fairchild, it seems to me, is the idea of, it didn't care where the idea came from. I seriously doubt that John Carter or Dick Hodgson came up with the idea that we should do, assembly in Hong Kong. An idea that comes in, from any level, what you need is a management, have that neural network inside your corporation to respond to it. And because great ideas can come from any place. And I think Fairchild would take a great idea wherever it came from, and they'd act on it. And I think that's a really key thing, because Fairchild, especially in the early days, when I joined, it was a ragtag bunch of guys, and they were all bright, but they were very, very different. There were, shouting contests. One of my favorite stories is early on, when Tom Bay was running marketing and Charlie Spork was running manufacturing, got into an argument, and Tom Bay broke his hand pounding on a bar, in an argument. It was just scary. When I got into an altercation with Tom about transferring an epitaxial reactor to National, when we were short of epitaxial capability, and Charlie had a commitment from Tom that he would give it, and I said, you can't do that, we need the capacity. Tom grabbed me by the shirt, by the tie, and strangled me, and said, I made a commitment, my commitment counts. Yes, sir,
You actually said yes, sir?
I said yes, sir, because he was 2 inches taller than I was, and I wasn't in a good position. I think I was stronger, but he was the boss. So, yeah.
Gordon, what was the reason for having a separate R&D center? Nobody else did that after that, right?
That's probably true, but at the time there was a lot of stuff that still had to be learned. We had a lot of technology that worked, but we had no idea why we we had to understand things better, and also we learned to develop products away from the manufacturing line. And it worked well for quite a while. But the more technically competent the manufacturing people became, the more difficult it came to transfer stuff to them. When all the expertise was in the laboratory, it was easy to transfer technology. But as they became competent, they wanted to re-engineer everything and start over, so it became very difficult.
You know, I remember that you had a guy there, a really smart guy named Phil Ferguson.
Yeah.
And Phil Ferguson, said that, Sanders is playing R&D like a piano. I remember that line. And all I was trying to do was get that great stuff you had over there, which was working fine, into production. And that was a tough thing to do. It really was a tough thing because, as Wilf mentioned, when they were at Motorola, they came, at Fairchild we had the ring and dot, and then we had the bigger ring and dot, and Motorola came out with the 2218, right? That was the star transistor. And it had the shape of a star, but because its perimeter was longer, and yet its capacitance was less, it was a faster device. And that competition, caused Fairchild to rethink some of their geometries, I think, or at least maybe just the competition said, because then they had the stripes. Remember those stripes that were, they looked like the Enron logo upside down or something. But those were, again, had a better ratio, and so it had a faster device. And getting that stuff from, the competition drove Fairchild to respond to get a better device. And then getting it over, really took somebody, working hard. But, yeah, I remember, Gordon, about the time, that you and Bob left, it was tough to get that new stuff into production.
Now, that was
Things
another
like
big
that
difference.
went pretty well. The one that was a pain in the neck was MOS. We had a spin-off that had a spin-off in MOS before we got any place in Fairchild.
Yeah.
But the good news is they didn't have Silicon Gate.
Jerry, do you remember Gordon's presentation at one of the sales meetings? I think it was maybe Hawaii or the Acapulco one, when he described how they came up with the shape of the emitter. Gordon, you must remember this.
That was San Diego.
Okay, tell the story.
Well, this was when the star transistor was getting all the publicity. And we had other ways of doing it, so I gave a talk where I came up with all the things I could think of in nature to show different shapes that made sense. Remember, I had astronomical pictures that showed spiral galaxies, pictures of the bottom of the ocean with all of the coral formations and the like, and was selecting from that what would make decent transistors. And they actually, they would have worked, but...
But then you described how Fairchild R&D was near a cow pasture on one of these. And you talked about Motorola being the clear skies looking up at the stars, and you guys looked at udders of cows, as I recall.
Yeah, that was one of them.
That was one of them, right?
Yeah.
I actually remember that one.
The biggest problem there actually was because Motorola was epitaxial. The chip size was a third.
Yeah.
And the cost was, much less. Because once you got that chip size down to a third, most of us didn't think that much about defect densities at that time, but automatically your defect density per chip or your defect density had less impact on the yield. So major difference in cost at the time.
Gordon just mentioned the transfer of MOS. If we can talk about what went wrong, I would say that MOS was kind of a death knell at Fairchild. I will posit that for just a moment, because number one, the military didn't want to buy it, and every spin-out went with MOS, and Fairchild didn't really ever get on the MOS thing for a long time.
Now, that was always the weakest point we had.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think? Is that accurate?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's interesting because Fairchild did incredible work in bipolar. There was no question. In fact, I ran into Bill Baker tonight. He did all that isoplanar work. Yeah. I know it. I tried to hire him many, many times. Unfortunately, he never showed me anything like what they showed you at TI, so I couldn't go back to my place and make isoplanar. But maybe that's good, because otherwise maybe we wouldn't have been so aggressive in trying to get into MOS. But I think I think that Fairchild, you had so many different people in MOS. That never really was their that was never their strength, and of course, it's the future.
And
but you never know. When T.J. Rogers left AMD to start Cypress, basically what he did, which was brilliant, was implement with CMOS technology all of our bipolar devices. And the technology was good enough that they were smaller, cheaper, and But if anything, again, competition is good, and it just spurred us on. It wasn't too pleasant at the time.
We have another audience question that we've kind of touched on with a number of legacy things, but we're getting close to where we're going to do a wrap here. And the question is, please comment on the long-term impact that Fairchild has had on world technology, culture, and style. In the technology area, we've obviously mentioned silicon, we've mentioned offshore, we've mentioned the impact of epitaxy, the cost drivers, we've mentioned Asia, we've mentioned using the best and brightest immigrants from wherever they were. What would we add in terms of style and culture?
I'll take that. I think Fairchild is really where Silicon Valley started, the phenomenon we've all come to love. The company exploded, had literally dozens of spin-offs that took these bits and pieces of technology. It developed a bunch of tools that were used broadly, and really developed the idea of the engineer entrepreneur who had an idea to go off and set something up. We weren't the first electronics company. There were the HPs and the Variants and so forth before, but they operated more like the classical companies that would have been any place in the country. But out of Fairchild, you had this tremendous explosion that I think has made Silicon Valley unique.
Most people say what starts a great area for startups, it's one big success. If you think about the different areas of the country, one success drove most of them. What would you say, Jerry, in the culture and style side?
Well, I think it was risk-taking, certainly. I mean, from the start of these 8 guys starting this company up, when Gordon is way too modest. I understand from a paper he once wrote that they actually had to go down and buy Nikon cameras and try to match up the lenses to build their first photolithographic equipment, to get the good match. And I mean, when you think of what they had to start with, and to start a company like this, and then to go forward with it, I think it was a tremendous risk. Frankly, I don't think they were ever rewarded appropriately at Fairchild. For example, my contribution was, minuscule compared to his at Fairchild, but I never made a penny on a Fairchild stock option. Never made a cent. And I pride myself that we made lots of money for our people at AMD with stock options. I think the concept of rewarding people and giving them a chance, the idea started at Fairchild, but it never really happened there. And I don't know whether that's because there were so many spin-outs that were, basically...
Well, it started late, right? It started later than the startup phase, right?
Yeah. There was a startup phase. We just did these 8 guys, Fairchild Semiconductor, wholly owned subsidiary of Fairchild Camera Instrument. Those guys made a lot of money.
Wilf, style and culture.
Some money on it. I really think that the thing that really amazed me at Fairchild was, and I'm quite sure it wasn't John Carter, that...
Poor John, he's taking a beating.
No, but the disproportionate amount of money that was spent on R&D. I mean, if I think back, one of the big surprises when we arrived from Motorola was to find that there was a $5 million computer, IBM, that was totally focused on trying to figure out how to accurately simulate and design computer-aided design. And I know when we started LSI Logic, Rob Walker and Jim Colford and Ed Jones, we did an assessment of what was the state of the art of the industry in 1979, or 1980. And it really hadn't moved in 10 years from what was being done at Fairchild in 1970. Hadn't moved. I mean, what had moved as Moore's Law, that the simulator that, you know, Jim wrote at Fairchild, that I tried to get Longo to do a deal on, but he wouldn't do it, was 10 years old at that time, but was more advanced than anything else in the industry when we started LSI Logic. So, I mean, somebody had a vision, and probably it was Bob and Gordon, to spend what would have seemed like an unreasonable amount of money to John Carter, probably would have seemed unreasonable to me at the time, as a percentage of what you were spending. But somehow that was done. And I think in a lot of other countries it would have been difficult to do that.
How'd that happen, Gordon?
They left us alone.
There's a lesson there. In wrapping up, Wilf, let's start with you. We're talking about legacy. We all learned a lot there. What do you predict for the next 10 years based on what you learned 50 years ago or 40 years ago?
I don't even know that it's relevant, actually. I mean, they probably do more of the same, but I mean, the whole global nature of things is changing very rapidly, and I do think Silicon Valley will have a major part to play, but you know, you see what's happening now in the Eastern Bloc, Russia, and so on. You see what's gone wrong with our educational system, and I think we're going to have a tough time in competing. And we've probably got to realize that and then come back. But I think we're in a downtrend now that's got to kind of hit a bottom and then it's got to come back. It's, I think the educational issue is going to hurt us.
Jerry, how do you see the future?
Actually, I'd like to just take a look at the past for a minute and project it into the future. If you look at this little badge that says, you know, we love Fairchild, I think Fairchild, and this happened on my watch. I'm not trying to take credit for it, but I think Fairchild really was the original brander. You know, now everybody talks about what's your brand, you know, how are you identified, what's your brand. If you think about some of Fairchild, I remember we had our Product of Week campaign, which was intended for me to show everybody we were an innovative company, introducing all sorts of exciting new things. We had the Yellow Smock campaign, showing how we were going to provide, you know, this high reliability stuff with this special team of people, and that was a brand. And then maybe the most important brand that never got the recognition, except it's still on these badges, is the Fairch campaign. Remember the red bar? We used to have at Fairchild, we used to have a flying F. It was a green F in a circle, the flying F, and you go into Hong Kong and you see that on the building. And then we had this crazy idea that was antiquated and didn't really represent the state of the art what we were. We were going to be the computer guys, and so we did this Fairchild campaign, and we kept shortening the Fairchild. We had the logo, the two red bars, and the big Fairchild in black, until it got shortened to Fairch. And the ad didn't say Fairchild Semiconductor; it just said Fairch. Everybody knew that Fairch, and what was the brand? The brand was, this is the innovator, the leader. And I think that branding continues today in our industry, but the future of our industry, as I see it, it's a global integrated company. You're not going to just manufacture in one place and have R&D in a different place. And Intel's, I think, on the way to that. You know, they've got R&D in Israel last time I looked, as well as manufacturing. But it's not going to be like Fairchild tried with SGS, where you're going to have a little factory assembling stuff in Sweden, and somebody assembling stuff in France, and somebody assembling stuff. You know, instead, it's going to be a global company with design centers in Russia, maybe R&D centers in Russia, China, certainly. It's going to be a global integrated company. That's the future. Because it all comes down to this. It's all about the people. The people in this room, you know, that built Fairchild, the people in the room that, and outside this room that built, you know, LSI Logic and AMD and Intel. That's what it's all about. It's the people. And it doesn't matter where they come from. It doesn't matter whether they're Russian or Chinese or Indian or American or anything.
Like it didn't matter at Fairchild R&D.
Didn't. It matters just, you know, just if you got great people, highly motivated, with a brand, they know what they stand for. You know, building blocks of ever-increasing complexity. Just know what you're doing. Don't lose that brand. And eventually, like Gordon says, we'll make everything for nothing.
You know, we were much more practical and national. You know what our brand was? If it uses springs, levers, stepping motors, or gears, it's performing logic, it's better done in silicon. And we went out and did watches and timers and everything that, calculators and everything that use springs, levers, stepping motors, and gears. And the process caused the Rust Belt. Anyway. Good idea. Gordon, the future.
Well, as Wolf said, more of the same. But the real things that are technologically different are things you have great difficulty predicting. They come out of the blue. You know, I guess Google I'd call their most recent example. Whoever imagined you'd be able to search the entire web in a half a second and get 500,000 responses back?
Incredible.
You know, it's well beyond anything I imagined that we were capable of electronically. And I think there'll be more things like that surprise us. I think the biggest concern is how the real populous countries, China and India in particular, come into this, and who controls the facilities that end up making the things. The world is going to change dramatically, and we have a real task to make sure it changes in a way that is at least neutral and preferably favorable for us.
You know, the thing that impresses me is how the kinds of problems that you folks solved that are way back there in those R&D deals, to understand how the transistor worked, to understand what was really going, some of the things you comment on tonight, are really what's now, where computing is now helping people understand health, the genome. I mean, the genome was a computer project, you know, and all these things are now using technology methods that really are industry and that started at Fairchild, you know, if you think about the methods by which they started. We're going to have to summarize here. I want to thank our panelists, Wolf Corrigan, Jerry Sanders, Gordon Moore, for their help. I want to thank everyone in the audience who had a part in building what became a real phenomenon, I won't say Fairchild, and thanks for being here tonight.
It's been a pretty good ride, huh? 50 years?
Yeah, a hell of a lot of fun.
Wow, it's great.